going to get started here. We're missing a few people, but we got Larry Mullins, and we've got the author of the study guide. Would you like to introduce yourself or state who you are, man? So,
sure, Micah Van Gorp, but yeah,
you're the authority here as far as that goes, because, well, I mean, we're working off your stuff. It's going to be important that I don't think I really have enjoyed the last few ones we did as far as that goes, just the conversation, getting some enlightenment straight from the author. It's crude expression, but getting it straight from the horse's mouth, as far as what's going on. And I really appreciate that. But we're going to crack into Matthew chapter 14 for those that have been following along and those who haven't, so that we get a proper introduction. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Micah, as far as that goes, to talk about Matthew 14 and what you put together here in the study guide. Maybe elaborate on it.
Gotcha. Well, in the first section of Matthew chapter 14, we're dealing with the execution of John the Baptist, and it's a bit of a interesting event, just in the fact that it happens it happens sort of earlier in the book than this event. Or there's parts of the story that are sort of set back or set forwards and then back. And there's just a sort of this element of we're sort of traveling back in time to explain this story, to set up the next story. And it's all sort of out of chronological sequence for which is how we would sort of like to read it. And so you have to sort of pay attention to this, because you have Herod hearing about Jesus and talking about John the Baptist must have been raised from the dead. But yet we know the rest of this chapter is sort of the events at the death of John the Baptist and immediately preceding that. It's just Matthew's way of sort of introducing this chapter, telling the important parts of the story, but yet also noting that Herod has some interest in Jesus now versus previously, where he was just a character out there that Herod didn't really care about. In chapter 2, we had talked briefly about how there's multiple Herods in the Bible, and a lot of times we don't figure out which ones are which until you really start looking at them. So this Herod is not the same Herod that the other two Herods that we've seen so far. The original one in Matthew chapter 2 is Herod the Great, and he had 5 children, and one of them succeeds him as ruling over Judea. But when he died, the Romans didn't want one person to rule all the area that he had ruled, so they split it up, and part of it went to the part around Galilee, went to this son Herod Antipas. So there's 2 different brothers, one who was ruling in Judea, one ruling in Galilee, and Antipas rules most of Jesus's lifespan. He wasn't given Galilee right away, but within a few years he was sort of granted rulership there, and he rules all the way through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he's the person that you're going to find at the trials of Jesus. He's the one who interrogates Jesus and then sends him back to Pontius Pilate. He's also the one you're going to find early in the book of Acts, executing and arresting some of the apostles. So this is the person we're talking about, the son of the Herod the Great from Acts 2. And as I mentioned in the study guide, his niece, Herodias, was married to his brother, which is forbidden in Scripture. The Old Testament law forbids that kind of marriage. But then she divorced her husband and went and married Herod Antipas after he divorced his wife, which was also forbidden in Scripture. And this is where John the Baptist comes into the scene, because though Herodias is doing wicked, sort of with a brother who's not really important to the picture. But here, as a ruler and someone who sort of portrays himself as a um, um, help to Israel, as a friend. The Herods didn't follow the Jewish law, but they aided the Jews in following the law. So Herod the Great built the temple. They often sort of were that buffer between Rome and the Jews, helping the Jews practice as they wanted. But so they sort of kept this portrayal that they were righteous, but everybody knew that they weren't. It's just that they aided them and kept Rome away from interfering with Jewish practice of law. So John the Baptist calls Herod out for marrying his niece, who was his brother's wife, and Herod doesn't like it, and he throws him in prison. And that's sort of the backstory that's really brings this in. And of course, in Matthew chapter 14 here, Matthew tells the story of how John is executed. And it's it's pretty straightforward. It's a very cunning method for Herodias to get rid of John the Baptist when Herod is a little bit uncertain that he wants to do so. I believe it's Luke, or may have been Mark, but one of the other Gospels, it mentions that Herod wanted to get rid of John, but he was afraid that the people were going to do riots and etc. because they thought he was a prophet. So he kept John around, but he didn't really want to because John, accused him of adultery, and he didn't like that. But as we see, Herodias finds a way around that to make sure that John is executed. And then John's disciples, so they'd be those who had followed him in the desert, or come and bury him, and then they go and they let Jesus know that his cousin John has been executed by Herod. And that's sort of that first section, and it sort of leads into one of the more famous stories in the Gospels.
Yep. And I just wanted to welcome as well Tim McDaniel, who has joined us here, and due to a little bit of neglect on my part, as well as has other things, I'm sure. But welcome, Tim McDaniel.
Welcome. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
That's the other reason I was wanting to welcome you, just to make sure that you were here. But we've got it back, but we've just covered the first section in for Matthew 14, which was John the Baptist and the beheading and everything like that, as far as his story part in here. And he just Micah just got finished describing basically the what was behind, at least what the writing that he put together for that section on the beheading of the John the Baptist. I thought it was interesting that that Matthew includes quite a bit of detail, and he gets into the history and everything like that on this part. So anyway.
Well, here's my question. If you haven't already answered it, you may have already answered it.
Okay.
So if you have, just tell me you answered it. But the question is, can you concisely run down the Herod family tree here?
I can attempt to. I sort of touched on it, but I'll just run through the whole thing here. You have Herod the Great, who's the patriarch of the lineage. He's the one you find in Matthew chapter 2, the one who's slaughtering boys in Bethlehem, talking to the Magi. He has 5 sons that are mentioned that survive his random scourges. He killed several of his sons off who he thought was going to overthrow him. But 5 of them that lived to adulthood, 4 of them are named in Scripture, referenced in Scripture. The first one is Archelaus, We find him also in Matthew chapter 2, when the Jesus and Joseph and Mary returning from Egypt, they find out that Archelaus is ruling in Judea in place of his father Herod, and that's when the angel warns them to go to Nazareth. On Herod's death, they split up his kingdom into 5 parts and granted it to different people. Archelaus received the area around Judea. A few years later, his brother Antipas received the area around Galilee. So this is the Herod that we're talking about in John, this story about John the Baptist. He's also the Herod you're going to find at the arrest and trials of Jesus. He's the Herod that you're going to find executing James, the brother of John. He's the Herod that's going to arrest Peter and throw him into prison. So he's the one who shows up a lot through the later half of the Gospels / into the book of Acts. He's the one who God strikes dead with the worms. So there's he's the one that's probably the most prevalent in the scriptures, but the one that most people don't really know because they forget that it's a different Herod than the other 2. The other 2 brothers, one is this Philip. He is named in one of the other Gospels in particular, but his wife's name is Herodias. And Herodias was the daughter of son number 4, not in necessarily birth order, but the 4th I'm going to mention. What's this? Who was it? Antipas. Oh, Aristobulus. So Aristobulus was the 4th son. He had the daughter Herodias. She married her uncle Philip. She divorced Philip to marry Antipas, the one we're dealing with in the story here. Sort of the biblical Herod. The 5th one is never named in scriptures. We know him from historical records, obviously, but he has 2 children that are important to the biblical story. King Agrippa and his sister Bernice, who preside over the trial and over Paul before he is sent to Rome. And so they would be the niece and nephew of this Herod, Philip, Aristobulus, Archelaus. And so, which I find interesting because the gospel story just continues to weave around this family that is overall pretty wicked. They do some pretty terrible things, both in the biblical text and outside of the biblical text. But they continue to be interacting with Jesus and John the Baptist and Paul the Apostle, Peter and James, and it's almost like God keeps calling them over and over. Because even at Paul's trial, King Agrippa was like, "Do you really think you can convert me?" And he's like, "I really do hope that you become a Christian like I am." And he challenges them. He's like, "You know these stories. Your grandfather was there. Your father was there. Your uncles were there. You know that what I'm talking about is true. So, pay attention." And but anyway, that's the Herod line. They sort of ended, phased out of rulership after that time period with Paul. They lost popularity with Rome and eventually just disappeared into history. But they definitely weave through the biblical story over and over.
Yeah, I like what I was in a small group earlier this week, and it was interesting as far as that goes. You get all these names because even you, I noticed, stumbled over some of the pronunciations as far as that goes because they're not common. And we were reading out of Philippians, and I remember whoever was reading one part, he was basically, and a biblical common name is what he called it, rather than actually trying to pronounce it. Because what gets me is names tend to change over the years, as far as what like Leroy and so forth like that. Some of the older names like Betty and so forth. It just they weave in and out as far as that goes, and the names continue. These were common names back then, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Even like somebody had pointed out to me, Jesus was not an uncommon name as far as that goes. People were all over the place named Jesus as far as that goes. But it's remarkable in my sense of the word. You got all these Jameses and you've got even a couple of Johns here, but there's only one Jesus as far as that goes. It tends to actually be named in Scripture, which I thought was interesting as far as the names go. But that it's fun to understand the different leadership roles that the Herods, the Herodian family, I like that as far as that goes. I think that's the first time, at least I noticed it when somebody mentioned it, as far as being described as a type of family name. It's interesting when you look at them as far as perspective, as far as they weave in and out. It's like the villain stays the same, so to speak, or what would be the villain in this case. So, but
yes, I think one of the things I noticed when I was reading through this is that I made reference to the fact that what Herod had done was against the law of God. But I didn't actually make the quote or even a reference to it. But it's back to Leviticus chapter 20 would be the passage that deals with this. In particular, verse 21, which is, if a man marries his brother's wife, is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. There's that whole chapter is talking about the different things that the Israelites were forbidden to do. And so even though Herod was not an Israelite, but because he was, in a sense at least, trying to pretend to follow the law of God, he was putting himself under the same rules and that God required of his people.
Yeah.
And thus John the Baptist called him out.
Right. It was the old saying, the truth hurts sometimes as far as that goes, especially when you see it in the mirror. As far as what's right and what's wrong. Because likening something similar to it, I've been wondering about it. Like I said, I've been writing some devotionals for JBQ, and it occurred to me I'd come up to the 10 Commandments, and you get into adultery as far as that goes, and trying to explain that to kids. And even that, the explanation, sometimes as blended as some families become in today's generation, it's sometimes hard to accept that as a commandment as far as that goes, or not want to avoid it. Similar to because there's a lot of people that have had issues, but it's one thing I've been trying to teach the kids as far as that goes, that sin always has its consequences. You can always be forgiven, but you're not going to necessarily get away from the consequences of what was done. And it's hard sometimes to accept those things. So
yes, definitely. We
but
love the idea that everyone's forgiven, but we do have to deal with the issues at hand as well.
Yeah.
I know when I was going through Matthew chapter 5 and writing it, I would keep telling my wife, like, people are not going to like that section. They're not going to like that.
Yeah.
She's like, well, did you write what it said? Yes, I did.
Yeah. It's like I said, the truth hurts sometimes.